The invisible cage. Introduction. Most people believe they speak freely. They don't. They repeat. Neuroscience has shown that the human brain is shaped by repetition. The circuits you use most often become stronger, faster, and automatic. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it doesn't care whether what you repeat is true or false. It only cares that it's familiar. That means the words you say every day are not harmless descriptions. They are training signals. Your brain treats repeated language as instruction. Over time, it stops questioning it and starts organizing behavior around it. This is why habits form. This is why beliefs feel solid. This is why certain outcomes keep repeating. And here's the part most people never hear. The brain does not distinguish between language spoken out loud and language spoken internally. Studies in cognitive science show that self-talk activates the same neural pathways as external commands. In other words, when you speak to yourself, your brain listens as if the order came from outside. That means your life didn't drift randomly. It followed instructions embedded in phrases you've repeated for years, sentences you learned early, language you absorbed before you were old enough to question it. This is just how I am. This is realistic. This is my limit. Once a sentence repeats long enough, the brain treats it as fact, not belief. Fact. This is not motivation, and it's not positive thinking. This is about exposing the language that's been quietly shaping your behavior, your confidence, and your choices without asking for your permission. Listen carefully, because once you start hearing your own words clearly, you won't be able to unhear them. And that's when the system begins to break. Chapter 1. The Invisible Spell. Your words are not neutral, they are instructions, and most of the ones you use every day are working against you. Not because you chose them, because they were installed. From the moment you learned how to speak, language began shaping what you believe is possible, what feels normal, what feels unrealistic, what you stop attempting before you even start. And you never agreed to that system. You were taught a version of language that keeps you contained. Inside invisible limits, you don't question anymore. Here's what almost nobody tells you. Your mind doesn't understand meaning. It understands repetition. Every phrase you repeat becomes a command. Every sentence you casually say becomes a direction. And once a sentence repeats enough times, your mind stops checking whether it's true. It assumes it must be, otherwise why would it keep hearing it? This is how the spell works. You don't wake up one day and decide to limit yourself. You explain yourself into a limitation. I'm not that kind of person. That's just how life is. I already know how this ends. Those aren't thoughts, they're closures. And once a sentence closes something in your mind, your behavior follows automatically. You hesitate, you adjust expectations, you settle. Not because you lack ability, but because your language already decided the outcome. But here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Most of the words you live by are not yours. They came from their parents, teachers, culture, authority. They were absorbed before you were old enough to question them. And once language is learned early enough, it feels like truth, not programming. That's why this runs so deep. Because language doesn't just describe reality, it selects it. It decides what you notice, what you ignore, what you attempt, what never even enters your awareness. And if you've ever felt like your life is on autopilot, like you're repeating patterns you didn't consciously choose, this is why. Your words have been chosen for you. In the next few minutes, you're going to start recognizing the exact sentence structures that quietly limit your confidence, your decisions, and your future. This isn't motivation. This isn't positive thinking. This is about reclaiming control over the language that's been running your life without permission. Because once you change the words, the spell weakens. And when the spell weakens, new options appear. Options that were always there, but hidden. This is where it starts. That means the words you say every day are not harmless descriptions. They are training signals. Your brain treats repeated language as instruction. Over time, it stops questioning it and starts organizing behavior around it. This is why habits form. This is why beliefs feel solid. This is why certain outcomes keep repeating. And here's the part most people never hear. The brain does not distinguish between language spoken out loud and language spoken internally. Studies in cognitive science show that self-talk activates the same neural pathways as external commands. In other words, when you speak to yourself, your brain listens as if the order came from outside. That means your life didn't drift randomly. It followed instructions embedded in phrases you've repeated for years, sentences you learned early, language you absorbed before you were old enough to question it. This is just how I am. This is realistic. This is my limit. Once a sentence repeats long enough, the brain treats it as fact, not belief. Fact. This is not motivation. And it's not positive thinking. This is about exposing the language that's been quietly shaping your behavior, your confidence, and your choices without asking for your permission. Listen carefully, because once you start hearing your own words clearly, you won't be able to unhear them. And that's when the system begins to break. Chapter 2. Autopilot Language. Most people believe they are in control of their lives, but if you listen closely to how they speak, you'll hear something else. The same phrases, the same explanations, the same limits, repeated daily. I'll try. I have to. I'm just being realistic. I don't really have a choice. These phrases sound harmless, responsible even, but they're not neutral. They signal submission. The mind treats language as authority. Whoever sounds certain gets obeyed. And when you speak in a way that removes choice, the mind follows that order automatically. It doesn't resist, it doesn't question, it complies. That's how autopilot forms. Not through a big decision, through casual language repeated long enough to feel normal. Once a phrase becomes familiar, it becomes safe, even if it's quietly shrinking your life. And here's the part most people miss. The subconscious mind doesn't care what you mean. It cares what you say. It doesn't understand irony. It doesn't understand exaggeration. It doesn't understand jokes you repeat about yourself. It only hears structure. So when you say, I'm bad at this, the mind doesn't ask for evidence. It logs a rule. When you say, this never works out for me, the mind doesn't challenge it. It prepares the environment to confirm it. This is why motivation doesn't last. You can watch inspiring videos, read books, make plans, but if your everyday language stays the same, the pattern reasserts itself, because language runs deeper than intention. You don't live according to what you want. You live according to what your language allows. And once a sentence becomes identity, effort feels exhausting, not because the task is hard, but because your internal commands are working against you. This is why some people seem to sabotage themselves without knowing why. They don't fail at the action, they fail at the instruction level. Their words already decided the ceiling, and the most effective part of this system is how invisible it is. Nobody forced these phrases on you, you repeat them voluntarily. And that makes the control almost perfect, because anything you repeat yourself feels true. But once you see this, something changes. You start noticing the language before the behavior, the sentence before the hesitation, the phrase before the excuse. And when you catch it early enough, it loses power, because language only controls you when it runs unnoticed. In the next section, you're going to see why this works so effectively, why sentences are far more powerful than thoughts, and why one line repeated long enough can override logic, desire, and even common sense. This is where the mechanism becomes obvious. Chapter 3. Sentences override thoughts. You've been told that thoughts create reality. That idea sounds clean, simple, comforting, but it's incomplete. Thoughts are unstable. They appear, disappear, contradict each other, and collapse under pressure. Sentences don't. A sentence feels finished, closed, certain. And certainty is what the mind obeys. A thought can be questioned. A sentence sounds like a conclusion. I might fail is a passing idea. I always fail is a rule. And the mind treats rules differently. When a sentence repeats, the mind stops analyzing it. It assumes the repetition itself is proof. Otherwise, why would the same structure keep returning? This is how language bypasses logic. Your mind does not ask whether a sentence is true. It asks whether it is familiar. Familiarity equals safety. Safety equals authority. That's why casual self-talk is far more powerful than people realize. I'm bad at this. I'm not built for that. I don't have what it takes. These don't feel dramatic. They feel honest, but honesty is not accuracy. Honesty just means the sentence feels familiar. And once a sentence feels familiar, the mind stops challenging it. Here's what happens next, and this is the part most people never notice. Once a sentence is accepted, behavior reorganizes around it automatically, not consciously, not deliberately. You stop seeing certain options, you stop considering certain paths, you stop responding when opportunities appear, not because you chose to, but because the sentence already decided what's allowed. This is why two people can hear the same opportunity and react completely differently. One hears, "That's not for me." The other hears, "I'll figure it out." Same situation, different sentence. And the sentence decides the outcome before action even begins. Sentences are powerful because they sound like endings, and endings relieve tension. An open question creates discomfort. A conclusion feels stable. The mind prefers a bad conclusion over uncertainty. That's why people cling to limiting sentences even when they hurt. This is just who I am. This is how life works. This always happens to me. These sentences close the loop. They explain everything. They justify everything. And once the loop is closed, growth stops, because growth requires open loops, unfinished sentences, uncertainty. That's also why the most damaging sentences are rarely emotional. They're reasonable. I'm just being realistic. I don't want to get my hopes up. I know my limits. These sound mature, responsible, intelligent. But listen to what they do. They lower expectations before effort begins. They remove tension before movement starts, and the mind obeys. Because sentences don't ask permission, they issue instructions. This is also why forcing positive thinking doesn't work. If you say a sentence that contradicts your existing language structure, the mind rejects it immediately. It doesn't argue, it just ignores it. Because authority isn't about positivity, it's about consistency. The sentence you repeat most often wins. That's why behavior change fails when language stays the same, and you can push yourself for weeks. You can rely on discipline for a while, but when pressure rises, the mind defaults to its highest authority. And that authority is not desired, not motivation, not goals. It's a language, the sentences you've been repeating quietly for years. This is why some people feel like they're fighting themselves. They are. Their actions are trying to move forward while their language is issuing stop commands in the background. And until that changes, effort will always feel heavier than it needs to be. In the next section, we're going to isolate the exact phrases that sabotage people the most, the ones that seem harmless, even smart, but quietly remove choice and power every time they're spoken. Chapter 4: Harmless Phrases That Remove Power. The most effective control doesn't sound like control, it sounds reasonable. That's why the phrases that limit people the most are the ones nobody questions. They don't feel negative, they don't feel dramatic, they feel normal. I'll try. That sentence quietly removes commitment. It tells the mind there's no real expectation of follow-through. The subconscious hears, "This doesn't need to happen," and it acts accordingly. "I have to." That one removes choice. It frames your life as an obligation instead of a decision. The mind responds by conserving energy, not expanding effort, because no one fully invests in what they feel forced to do. "I'm busy." This phrase does more damage than people realize. It doesn't describe time, it describes identity. It tells the mind that your attention is already occupied, your capacity is full, and nothing new is welcome. After enough repetition, opportunity stops knocking because the sentence already says no. "I'm just being realistic." This is one of the most dangerous sentences in modern language. It sounds intelligent, responsible, grounded, but what it really does is lower expectations before action begins. It trains the mind to aim down instead of forward. Realism, used this way, isn't wisdom. It's a preemptive surrender. "I don't have a choice." This sentence is especially powerful because once the mind accepts it, responsibility disappears. And when responsibility disappears, so does power. The mind shifts into compliance mode. It stops searching for alternatives, because none exist, but because the sentence said they don't. Here's what all these phrases have in common. They remove authority from the speaker, they place you in a reactive position instead of a directive one, and the subconscious follows hierarchy. It obeys whoever sounds certain, even if that certainty is limiting. This is why language works as control. You don't need threats, you don't need force, you just need people to repeat phrases that quietly lower their own position, and they do every day. What makes this system nearly invisible is that these phrases are socially rewarded. They sound polite, responsible, non-threatening. Nobody challenges them. But once you hear them clearly, you'll notice something. They always appear right before hesitation, right before the delay, right before giving up. The sentence comes first. The behavior follows, and the moment you stop using these phrases, something feels uncomfortable, because open language creates tension. I will. I choose to. I'm figuring this out. These don't feel safe at first. They feel exposed, because now the mind has to stay engaged. The discomfort is not danger. Its power is returning. In the next section, we're going to trace where these phrases came from, why they feel so natural, and why most people mistake inherited language for truth. Once you see the source, the spell weakens even more. Chapter 5. Borrowed language, borrowed limits. Here's the part most people never question. The sentences you live by did not start with you. You didn't invent them. You inherited them. Before you were old enough to analyze language, you absorbed it. Before you could evaluate meaning, you repeated it. And before you could choose differently, it already felt like the truth. That's how this system survives. Language is installed early because early language bypasses resistance. When a child hears a sentence often enough, it doesn't become an idea, it becomes reality. This is how life works. People like us don't do that. Be realistic. Don't expect too much. These sentences weren't taught as rules, they were delivered casually. And casual repetition is the most effective form of programming, because nothing feels more trustworthy than something you've always known. That's why these phrases feel natural when you say them now. They don't feel imposed, they feel like you, but they're not. They came from parents who were repeating what they were taught, from teachers trained to enforce structure, not expansion, from systems designed to reward predictability. And once language passes through enough mouths, it loses its origin. It becomes invisible. This is why most people confuse familiarity with truth. A sentence repeated for years doesn't feel like a sentence anymore. It feels like a fact. This is just how I am. This is how things work. This is my limit. Those statements don't come from analysis. They come from conditioning. And here's the critical detail. Language learned early carries more authority than language learned later. That's why even intelligent adults struggle to override simple phrases they heard as children, because the subconscious ranks language by age, not accuracy. Older sentences sit deeper, they override newer ones. That's why change feels so difficult. You're not fighting logic, you're fighting hierarchy. New ideas don't fail because they're wrong. They fail because they don't outrank the old sentences yet. And the system depends on this, because once people mistake inherited language for personal identity, control becomes effortless. No force required, no enforcement needed. People regulate themselves. They say the words. They reinforce the limits. They stay inside the boundaries voluntarily. This is why you can remove external pressure and nothing changes. The guard is internal now, and it speaks in your voice. That's the most effective part. The language controlling you doesn't sound foreign. It sounds familiar, comfortable, reasonable. That's how you know it's not yours. Real choice feels unfamiliar at first, awkward, unstable, because it hasn't been repeated enough to feel safe. And this is where most people turn back. They mistake discomfort for danger. But discomfort is just the absence of rehearsal. The moment you see this clearly, something shifts. You stop blaming yourself for patterns you didn't consciously create. You stop assuming resistance means incapacity. You realize you've been following instructions that were never examined. And once language is exposed as inherited, not innate, it loses authority, not instantly, but steadily, because awareness weakens repetition, and repetition is the only thing keeping the spell intact. In the next section, we're going to move from origin to effect, how these sentences don't just shape decisions, but directly affect the body, the nervous system, and the way energy moves through you. This is where the control becomes physical. Chapter 6. When language enters the body. This system doesn't stop at thought. That's the mistake most people make. They think language only lives in the mind, as if words stay abstract, as if they don't go anywhere. They do. The body listens before the mind explains. That's why certain words hit instantly, not emotionally, physically. Your chest tightens, your breathing changes, your energy drops or spikes before you can name why. That reaction is not imagination, it's conditioning. Language triggers the nervous system automatically, no analysis required. When a sentence signals threat, limitation, or submission, the body responds as if it's real, because to the nervous system, repetition equals reality. That's why the same phrases produce the same physical states. Say, I'm overwhelmed enough times, and the body learns the posture of overwhelm. Say, I can't handle this, and the system prepares for collapse. Not symbolically, physically. Muscle tone shifts. Breathing becomes shallow. Focus narrows. And once the body associates certain phrases with certain states, the loop is complete. Now, language doesn't just describe experience, it creates it. This is how people stay stuck even when nothing external is forcing them. Their body is responding to internal commands that never shut off. And here's the part almost nobody notices. The body cannot tell whether a sentence refers to the present, the past, or the future. It only hears the instruction. When you say, "This always happens to me," your nervous system doesn't treat it as commentary. It treats it as a forecast. It prepares accordingly. That preparation changes behavior. Behavior changes the outcome. Outcome reinforces the sentence. The loop closes. This is why stress feels permanent for some people. Not because life is objectively harder, but because their language keeps signaling threat. And once the nervous system stays activated long enough, calm begins to feel unfamiliar. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels wrong, because the body has learned to expect tension, and language is the trigger. This is also why people feel tired without doing anything physical. Their language is constantly issuing commands that require energy. Worry is energy. Self-criticism is energy. Defensive explanation is energy. The body pays for every sentence. And the more familiar the sentence, the faster the body responds. That's why this system works so efficiently. You don't have to think yourself into stress. You speak it. You don't have to choose anxiety. You announce it. And once the body responds, the mind follows. People assume emotions cause language. Most of the time, it's the other way around. Language sets the state. The state justifies the language. This is also why changing behavior without changing language fails at the physical level. You can force productivity. You can force positivity. But if your internal language keeps signaling danger, the body will resist. Fatigue appears, procrastination appears, discomfort appears, not as sabotage, but as self-protection. The body is responding correctly to the instructions it's been given. And this is where the system becomes nearly unbreakable for most people, because they interpret physical resistance as proof. I feel tired, so I must be incapable. I feel anxious, so this must be wrong. I feel heavy, so I should stop. But those sensations weren't generated by reality. They were generated by language, repeated, unquestioned, internalized. Once you see this, something becomes obvious. If language can condition the body into limitation, it can also release it, not through affirmations, not through hype, but through removing commands that never should have been there. That's what we move into next. In the next section, you'll see how language acts like a lens, how it filters what you notice, what you miss, and why two people can live in the same world and experience completely different realities without realizing why. Chapter 7. Language as a Filter. By the time language reaches your body, something else has already happened. Your perception has been filtered. This is where the system becomes invisible. You don't experience reality directly. You experience what your language allows you to notice. Every sentence you repeat acts like a lens. It sharpens some things, it erases others. Two people can stand in the same place, hear the same information, face the same opportunity, and walk away with completely different conclusions. Not because one is smarter, because one is speaking a different internal language. Language decides what counts as relevant. If your internal sentence says, "This isn't for people like me," your attention never even locks onto the opportunity. It passes right through your awareness without resistance. You don't reject it, you don't debate it, you simply don't see it. That's how control works best. Not by forcing decisions, but by filtering options before they register. This is why people say things like, "I don't know how others do it," while standing next to people who are doing exactly that. They are not blind, they are filtered. Language tells the brain what to highlight and what to ignore. If your sentence says "this is risky," your mind starts scanning for danger. If your sentence says "this is possible," your mind starts scanning for pathways. Same reality, different filter, and the filter always wins. This is also why arguments rarely change anyone's life. Facts don't override filters. You can present evidence, you can show examples, you can explain step by step. But if the listener's language filter says, "That won't work for me," the information never lands. It's not rejected, it's dismissed before processing. This is why people feel stuck, even when surrounded by opportunity. They don't lack access. They lack permission. And permission is granted by language. Here's something that should unsettle you. Your filter is active even when you're silent. Internal language runs constantly, judging, labeling, explaining. You're narrating your life whether you realize it or not. And that narration decides what reality looks like. If the internal sentence is "this is pointless," energy drops instantly. If the sentence is "this is dangerous," tension appears instantly. If the sentence is "this is not enough," dissatisfaction becomes permanent. The body responds, the mind adjusts, the world reflects it back, not symbolically, mechanically. This is why the same situation produces different lives. One person interprets resistance as a signal to stop. Another interprets it as a signal to adapt. Different sentence, different outcome. The filter doesn't care which one is true. It enforces whichever one is repeated. And here's the most dangerous part. Once a filter has been running long enough, it feels objective. This is just how things are. I'm just being honest. I see reality clearly. But clarity is not neutrality. It's conditioning that's gone unnoticed. The moment you start questioning the filter, reality starts to expand. Not because the world changed, but because more options become visible. That expansion feels uncomfortable at first, because uncertainty returns, and uncertainty threatens the old sentences. That's why the mind resists awareness, not because awareness is harmful, but because it disrupts certainty. And certainty is the currency of control. In the next section, we're going to expose the final mechanism that keeps this system locked in place, the one that makes people defend the very language that limits them. Once you see it, you'll understand why change feels risky, even when staying the same hurts. Chapter 8. Why people defend the sentences that trap them. Here's the final lock in the system. And it's the reason this works so well. People don't just repeat limiting language, they defend it. Not because it's true, because it feels necessary. Once a sentence has been repeated long enough, it becomes part of identity. An identity doesn't like to be questioned. When someone challenges your language, it doesn't feel like feedback, it feels like a threat. That's why people react emotionally when their phrases are questioned. That's just how I talk. I'm just being honest. I'm not like those people. Those responses aren't arguments, they're shields. Because if a sentence collapses, something uncomfortable happens. Responsibility returns. If "I don't have a choice" stops being true, then choice exists, and choice creates pressure. If "This is just how I am" breaks down, then identity becomes flexible, and flexibility requires effort. So the mind protects the sentence, not because it's accurate, but because it stabilizes the story. This is why people cling to explanations that keep them small. They reduce uncertainty, they reduce risk, they reduce exposure. Language becomes armor, and armor is heavy, but it feels safer than being open. Here's what most people don't realize. The mind will choose familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom every time, because familiar pain is predictable. Unfamiliar freedom is not. That's why someone can complain about their situation endlessly and still resist any language that suggests change. Because change doesn't threaten the problem, it threatens the identity built around it. And the system depends on this reaction. If people questioned their internal language freely, the entire structure would collapse. So the language is designed to sound reasonable. I'm just being cautious. I'm just being realistic. I don't want to get disappointed. These phrases sound like wisdom, but they perform one function. They prevent expansion. They keep the internal narrative intact, and once a person identifies with their limitations, control is complete. No enforcement needed, no pressure applied. They self-regulate, they correct themselves, they shut down impulses before action forms, and they call it maturity. This is why awareness feels dangerous at first, not because it harms you, but because it destabilizes the internal hierarchy. The old sentences lose authority. New sentences haven't taken their place yet. That gap feels uncomfortable. The mind labels it uncertainty, or risk, or anxiety. But it's not dangerous, it's the absence of programming. Most people rush to fill that gap as fast as possible. They return to familiar language, familiar explanations, familiar limits, because the system trained them to fear open space. But once you understand this, something changes. You stop arguing with the language, you stop fighting it, you simply stop believing it automatically, and that's enough, because language only controls you when it goes unquestioned. The moment a sentence becomes optional, it loses force, not immediately, but inevitably. And this is why this information isn't widespread, because it doesn't require rebellion, it requires awareness. And awareness doesn't announce itself, it just quietly removes authority. In the next and final section, we're not going to talk about motivation or goals or positivity. We're going to talk about how to weaken this system without triggering resistance, how to change the direction of your life by adjusting language in a way the mind cannot fight. This is where control actually returns. Chapter 9. How the Spell Breaks Without a Fight. Here's what most people get wrong when they try to change. They attack the language, they try to replace it, override it, force something new on top of it, and the mind resists immediately. Not because the old sentences are true, but because they're familiar. Familiarity is authority, so the system doesn't break when you confront it head-on. It breaks when you stop feeding it certainty. This is the part that matters. You don't weaken a sentence by arguing with it. You weaken it by removing its finality. The subconscious does not fight uncertainty. It only enforces conclusions. That's why rigid affirmations fail. I am successful. I am confident. I am powerful. If those sentences contradict the existing hierarchy, the mind rejects them without discussion, not consciously, automatically, because they sound false, and false sentences have no authority. So the system survives, not because it's strong, but because people try to break it the wrong way. Here's how it actually weakens. You don't replace I can't with I can. You replace it with something that doesn't trigger resistance. I'm learning. I'm figuring this out. I haven't decided yet. These sentences don't demand belief. They remove the restriction. They don't sound inspiring. They sound open. And openness is dangerous to the system, because once a sentence is open-ended, the mind has to stay engaged. It can't close the loop. It can't default to the old pattern. That's where change begins. Not with confidence, but with interruption. Here's the critical detail. The subconscious treats language like software. It doesn't care about meaning. It cares about structure. If a sentence sounds flexible, behavior becomes flexible. If a sentence sounds final, behavior collapses into routine. So the goal is not to speak positively. The goal is to stop speaking conclusively against yourself. Remove words like always, never, just, that's how it is. Those words lock the system. Once they disappear, pressure returns, not external pressure, but internal alertness. The mind wakes up. And here's what most people don't expect. That alertness feels uncomfortable at first, because the old language numbed awareness. It provided certainty, even when that certainty was limiting. When the sentences weaken, uncertainty returns, and uncertainty demands attention. That's why people relapse into old language, not because it's true, but because it's soothing. Familiar sentences anesthetize responsibility, open sentences restore it. This is also why silence is powerful. When you stop narrating everything, the system loses traction. The mind doesn't like gaps, it tries to fill them. And when the old language no longer fits, something new has to form. But you don't rush it. You let the system destabilize, because instability is not failure. It's a transition. This is where most people panic. They feel the absence of the old narrative and assume something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. The spell is loosening. You're no longer being commanded internally every second. And that's when something subtle begins to happen. Your reactions slow down. Your decisions feel less automatic. Your behavior stops repeating on schedule. Not dramatically, quietly. And that's how real change happens. Not as a breakthrough, as a drift. The system doesn't collapse loudly, it starves. And once the language feeding it weakens, the structure has nothing left to stand on. In the final section, we're not going to end with motivation or promises. We're going to end with a single realization, the one that makes all of this irreversible once you see it. Because after that, you won't be able to unhear your own language again. Chapter 10. The sentence you can't unhear. At this point, something should feel different. Not inspired, not excited, alert. Because once you see how language works, you can't go back to hearing it the same way. You'll start noticing the sentence before the reaction, the phrase before the hesitation, the words before the withdrawal. And that's the point of no return. This system only works when it stays invisible. The moment you hear your own language clearly, it loses its authority, not all at once, but permanently. Because awareness doesn't need effort, it just needs attention. From now on, every time you speak, something subtle will happen. Part of you will listen. You'll hear when a sentence closes a door. You'll hear when a phrase removes choice. You'll hear when language shrinks the field before you even move. And you won't be able to pretend you didn't hear it. That's why this information feels dangerous, not because it harms you, but because it removes excuses. Once you know that language precedes behavior, you can't blame motivation. You can't blame circumstances. You can't blame luck. Because the instruction came first, and you gave it. That doesn't mean control is instant. It means repetition is no longer innocent. From now on, every sentence becomes a decision point, not a dramatic one, a quiet one, and quiet decisions are the ones that shape entire lives. Most people wait for big moments to change. They wait for clarity. They wait for certainty. But certainty is how the system keeps running. Lives don't change at the level of events. They change at the level of language. Because language is upstream from everything else. It's upstream from emotion, upstream from behavior, upstream from identity. That's why nothing external needs to change for this to start working. No new plan, no new belief, no new personality, just fewer unconscious sentences. That's all it takes. You don't need to speak better words. You need to stop speaking against yourself automatically. The moment that stops, the system begins to weaken on its own. And here's the part that makes this irreversible. Once you realize that most people are living inside sentences they never chose, you'll hear it everywhere. In conversations, in the media, in yourself. You'll notice how often people announce their limits before anything happens. And you'll notice how rarely anyone questions the language doing the announcing. That's when something changes permanently. Not in your behavior, in your awareness. And awareness doesn't go backwards. From now on, when you hear yourself say, "That's just how it is," something will pause. When you hear yourself say, "I don't have a choice," something will interrupt. When you hear yourself say, "I already know how this ends," something will stay open. That pause is the gap. And the gap is where control returns. No control over the world. Control over the instruction. That's the only control that matters, because the world responds to behavior. Behavior responds to language, and language responds to repetition. Once repetition becomes conscious, the spell is finished. It doesn't explode. It doesn't collapse. It simply stops running. And from that point forward, your life won't change loudly. It will change sentence by sentence, quietly, irreversibly. That's where this ends and where it actually begins.